Right now, there are people holding thousands of XRP without fully understanding what they might actually be sitting on. And what you are about to hear could completely change the way you look at your holdings. Because while most people are focused on short term price moves and daily market noise, a much bigger picture is quietly forming in the background. And if that picture plays out the way many experts believe it could, then holding 5,000 XRP might not just be a random number. It might represent a level of positioning that very few people truly appreciate today, especially when you start connecting the dots between global finance, institutional adoption, and the real utility that XRP is designed to provide in a system that is slowly shifting away from outdated methods and moving toward faster, more efficient solutions. When people hear the number 5,000 XRP, they often compare it to today's price and make quick judgments, thinking in terms of small gains or limited upside. But that way of thinking completely ignores the core idea behind why XRP was created in the first place, because this is not just another digital asset built for speculation. It was designed with a specific purpose, and that purpose is deeply connected to how money moves across borders, how banks settle transactions, and how liquidity is managed on a global scale, which is a system worth trillions of dollars, not billions. And when you begin to understand that scale, you start to realize that even a relatively small amount of XRP today could represent something much bigger in the future. The financial system that we use today is slow, expensive, and full of inefficiencies, especially when it comes to international transfers, where transactions can take days to settle and involve multiple intermediaries, each taking a fee and adding friction to the process. And this is exactly the problem that XRP aims to solve by offering near instant settlement, low transaction costs, and the ability to act as a bridge currency between different fiat systems, which means that instead of relying on pre funded accounts and complex banking relationships, institutions can use XRP to move value quickly and efficiently, reducing costs and freeing up capital that would otherwise be locked in the system. Now, think about what happens if this technology is not just tested, but actually adopted at scale. If major financial institutions begin to rely on XRP for liquidity and settlement, and if regulatory clarity continues to improve in key markets, then the demand for XRP could increase in ways that most retail investors are not currently factoring in, because the conversation would shift from speculation to real world usage. And when an asset moves from being seen as a speculative investment to becoming a core part of financial infrastructure, its value proposition changes completely. And that is where the idea of 5,000 XRP becoming powerful starts to make more sense. Another important factor that many people overlook is supply, because while there are billions of XRP in existence, not all of it is freely circulating in the market. And as adoption grows, a portion of that supply could become locked in various use cases, reducing the available liquidity and potentially creating upward pressure on price over time, especially if demand continues to increase. And this is a dynamic that has been seen in other markets as well, where assets with strong utility and growing demand begin to experience significant price movements once a certain threshold is crossed. At the same time, it is important to understand that the journey is not instant and the market does not move in a straight line. There will be periods of uncertainty, corrections, and external factors that influence price action, including regulatory developments, macroeconomic conditions, and overall sentiment in the cryptocurrency space. But for those who are looking beyond the short term and focusing on the bigger picture, these fluctuations can be seen as part of a longer process rather than a final outcome. What makes this situation even more interesting is that we are still in a phase where awareness is relatively low compared to where it could be in the future, because most people are still focused on more popular narratives or trending assets, while the deeper infrastructure plays are often overlooked until they become impossible to ignore. And by the time that shift happens, the opportunity to accumulate at lower levels may already be gone, which is why understanding the potential behind a specific holding like 5,000 XRP is not just about numbers. It is about timing, positioning, and recognizing value before it becomes widely accepted. As the global financial system continues to evolve, the role of digital assets is becoming more prominent, and projects that offer real solutions to existing problems are more likely to stand out in the long run. And XRP, with its focus on cross border payments and liquidity, fits into that category in a way that few other assets do, which is why the idea that 5,000 XRP could be more powerful than it seems is not just speculation. It is a perspective that is rooted in understanding how technology, finance, and adoption intersect in a rapidly changing world. And this is just the beginning of the picture, because once you start looking at how institutions, regulations, and global demand all connect, the potential implications become even more interesting, especially for those who are already holding and trying to figure out what their position could mean in the years ahead. When you go deeper into this idea, the real power of holding 5,000 XRP starts to become clearer once you understand how early positioning works in markets that are still developing. Because history has shown again and again that the biggest gains are not made when something becomes obvious to everyone, but rather when only a small group of people truly understand what is happening before the rest of the world catches on. And this is exactly where many XRP holders may find themselves today, in a phase where the technology exists, the use case is clear, but full scale adoption is still in progress, creating a unique window where the gap between current price and future potential could still be wide. One of the biggest drivers behind this potential is institutional involvement, because unlike retail investors who often focus on short term profits, institutions think in terms of efficiency, cost reduction, and long term infrastructure. And XRP is designed in a way that directly aligns with those goals, especially when it comes to cross border payments, where billions of dollars move every single day. And even small improvements in speed and cost can lead to massive savings over time. And when you consider that large financial institutions are always looking for ways to optimize their operations, it becomes easier to see why a solution like XRP could gain serious attention. At the same time, the concept of liquidity plays a major role in understanding the value of XRP, because in traditional systems, liquidity is often fragmented and requires banks to hold funds in multiple currencies across different countries, which ties up capital and creates inefficiencies. But with XRP acting as a bridge asset, that process can be simplified, allowing value to move freely without the need for pre funded accounts. And if this model becomes widely adopted, the demand for XRP as a liquidity tool could increase significantly, which in turn could impact its price over time. Another important piece of the puzzle is regulation, because for a long time, uncertainty around rules and legal frameworks has held back many digital assets from reaching their full potential. But as governments and regulatory bodies begin to provide clearer guidelines, the environment becomes more stable and more attractive for institutional participation. And this shift could act as a catalyst for increased adoption, especially for assets that are already positioned to work within regulated systems. And XRP has been at the center of many of these discussions, which means that any positive developments in this area could have a strong impact on its future trajectory. What makes 5,000 XRP particularly interesting is that it sits at a level that is still achievable for many individuals today, but could become much harder to accumulate in the future if demand increases and price starts to move higher. And this creates a situation where early holders may have an advantage, not just because of price, but because of access, since entering a position at lower levels allows for greater exposure to potential upside compared to trying to build the same position later at higher prices. There's also a psychological aspect that comes into play because many people underestimate what they hold simply because the current value does not seem life changing. But markets have a way of shifting perception very quickly once momentum builds, and assets that were once ignored can suddenly become the center of attention, driving new waves of interest and participation. And when that happens, those who already hold positions may find themselves in a completely different situation than they expected. Yeah, at the same time, it is important to stay grounded and realistic because while the potential is there, outcomes are never guaranteed, and the path forward will depend on a combination of factors, including adoption, competition, technological development, and broader market conditions. But the key idea here is not about making bold predictions, it is about understanding the asymmetry of the opportunity, where the downside may be limited compared to the possible upside if the right conditions are met over time. As more people begin to explore the role of digital assets in the global economy, the conversation is slowly shifting from speculation to utility. And this is where XRP has a unique position because its value is tied not just to market sentiment, but to its ability to solve real problems in the financial system. And if that value becomes widely recognized, then the significance of holding a specific amount like 5,000 XRP could look very different from how it looks today. And as this shift continues, the next step is to look at what happens when real adoption starts to take shape, because that is where theory turns into reality and where the true impact of holding XRP begins to unfold in ways that most people are still not fully prepared for. As we move further into this discussion, the real question is not just whether XRP has potential, but what happens when that potential begins to translate into real world usage at scale, because this is the stage where everything starts to change, where the gap between speculation and reality begins to close, and where assets that were once underestimated suddenly become essential. And if XRP reaches that point, then holding 5,000 XRP could carry a level of importance that is difficult to fully grasp when looking only at today's market conditions. One of the most important things to understand here is how adoption actually works in large systems, because it does not happen overnight and it does not happen in a straight line. Instead, it moves in phases, starting with testing and partnerships, then expanding into limited use cases, and eventually reaching a point where it becomes part of everyday operations. And XRP has already gone through some of these early stages with ongoing developments in cross border payments and financial integrations, which means the foundation is already being built, even if the full picture is not yet visible to the public. When adoption begins to accelerate, the effects can be powerful because demand is no longer driven only by investors, but also by institutions and systems that require the asset to function. And this creates a different type of market dynamic where buying pressure is tied to usage rather than speculation. And in such a scenario, price movements can become more sustained and less dependent on hype because the asset is being used as part of a larger financial process. And this is where the idea of XRP becoming a bridge currency becomes especially important. Think about the scale of global transactions that happen every single day, from remittances to corporate payments to interbank settlements, and imagine even a small percentage of that volume flowing through XRP. The impact on demand could be significant because, unlike traditional assets that are simply held, XRP in this context would be actively used to facilitate transactions, meaning it would need to be available in sufficient quantities to support that activity. And if demand increases faster than available supply, it could create conditions where price begins to reflect that imbalance. Another key factor to consider is speed and efficiency, because in a world that is becoming more digital and more connected, the ability to move value quickly is becoming increasingly important. And systems that can offer near instant settlement with low costs have a clear advantage over slower, more expensive alternatives. And this is exactly the space where XRP operates, positioning itself as a solution for modern financial needs rather than a legacy system trying to adapt to new demands. At the same time, competition cannot be ignored because there are other projects and technologies aiming to solve similar problems. And the outcome will depend on which solutions prove to be the most reliable, scalable, and widely accepted. But what sets XRP apart is its focus on working within existing financial structures rather than completely replacing them, which could make it more attractive for institutions that are looking for improvements without needing to overhaul their entire system. Now, when you bring this back to the idea of holding 5,000 XRP, the perspective starts to shift again because instead of thinking in terms of a static investment, you begin to see it as a position within a system that could grow in relevance over time. And as that system expands, the value of being part of it early could become more significant, especially if access becomes more limited or more expensive in the future. There is also the element of timing because markets tend to move in cycles, and periods of low attention are often followed by periods of intense focus. And those who position themselves during quieter phases are often the ones who benefit the most when momentum returns. And while no one can predict exactly when these shifts will happen, understanding where we are in the broader cycle can help provide context for why certain opportunities may exist at specific moments. At the same time, it is important to remain patient and disciplined because the process of adoption and growth takes time, and there will be moments where progress feels slow or uncertain. But these are often the phases where the groundwork is being laid for future expansion. And those who are able to maintain a long term perspective may be better positioned to see the full picture as it develops. As the discussion goes deeper, it becomes more important to focus on how value could realistically scale if XRP continues moving toward broader financial integration, because this is the point where most people start to misunderstand the situation by only looking at price charts while ignoring the underlying systems that actually create long term value. And when you shift the focus from short term trading to long term infrastructure adoption, the idea of holding 5,000 XRP begins to take on a very different meaning, especially in a world where digital settlement systems are becoming more relevant each year. To understand this properly, you need to think about how value is created in financial networks because in traditional markets, value is not only based on what something is, but also on how much it is used and how essential it becomes within a system. And when an asset becomes a necessary part of transactions, its importance increases beyond simple speculation because it is no longer just something people buy and sell, but something that is required for the system to function efficiently. And this is where XRP's role as a liquidity bridge becomes a key part of the conversation. If XRP were to become widely used for cross border payments, even at a modest level, the amount of liquidity required to support that system would be significant because financial institutions operate at massive scale, and even small percentages of global transaction flow represent billions of dollars moving through networks every day. And in such a scenario, XRP would need to facilitate that movement in real time, which naturally increases demand for the asset itself, not just as an investment, but as an operational tool. Another important aspect to consider is how capital efficiency plays into this picture, because one of the biggest challenges in global finance today is the amount of capital that remains locked in pre funded accounts across different regions. And this reduces flexibility and increases cost for institutions. But if XRP is used to solve this problem, then that locked capital could be freed up and redirected elsewhere, creating a more efficient system overall. And efficiency improvements at that scale often translate into strong interest from major players who prioritize optimization over everything else. At the same time, market behavior must also be considered because even when real utility exists, price does not always move in a direct or immediate way. Instead, it often reflects a combination of adoption, sentiment, liquidity conditions, and macroeconomic factors, which means there can be periods where progress is happening behind the scenes but not fully reflected in price. And this is why long term perspective becomes important when evaluating something like XRP, especially when thinking about a fixed holding such as 5,000 XRP. It is also worth noting that as adoption grows, accessibility can change over time because when assets are less widely understood or less widely adopted, they tend to remain within certain price ranges for longer periods. But as awareness increases and more participants enter the market, the dynamics begin to shift, and what once felt like a large holding can become increasingly difficult to accumulate at the same level, which is why early positioning often carries strategic importance, even if the immediate impact is not always visible. Another layer to this discussion is global financial modernization, because many countries and institutions are actively exploring faster and more cost effective payment systems, and blockchain based solutions are part of that exploration. And if XRP continues to position itself as a practical solution within regulated environments, it could benefit from this broader shift toward digital financial infrastructure, which is not limited to one region, but is happening across multiple markets at the same time. When you combine all of these elements together, the picture becomes more structured because you are no longer looking at XRP in isolation, but as part of a larger transformation in how money moves globally. And in that context, holding 5,000 XRP is not just about a number, but about participation in a system that could evolve significantly over time, depending on how adoption unfolds and how institutions choose to integrate new technologies into their operations. Of course, it is also important to stay realistic because even strong ideas face challenges and adoption takes time, and competition and regulation will continue to shape the outcome. But the key point here is not certainty, it is probability and positioning, because in financial markets, those who understand potential shifts early are often the ones who benefit the most when those shifts become reality, even if the timing is uncertain. And as this entire picture continues to develop, the final layer becomes even more important because it brings together the risks, the expectations, and the responsible approach to thinking about any financial decision involving digital assets, which is where we need to conclude this breakdown with a clear and grounded perspective. As we reach the final part of this breakdown, it is important to bring everything back into a clear and grounded perspective. Because while the idea of holding 5,000 XRP can sound powerful when connected to global adoption, institutional usage, and financial transformation, the reality is that markets are always uncertain and no outcome in the financial world is guaranteed, especially in emerging technologies where adoption is still developing and regulations are still evolving across different regions, which means every projection must be understood as a possibility rather than a promise. The most important thing to recognize is that digital assets like XRP operate in a highly dynamic environment where price movements are influenced by multiple factors at the same time, including investor sentiment, global liquidity conditions, macroeconomic trends, regulatory decisions, and technological progress. And because all of these factors change constantly, it becomes impossible for anyone to predict exact outcomes with certainty, no matter how strong the narrative or how promising the technology may appear at any given moment. At the same time, the long term discussion around XRP is often centered on its utility and its potential role in improving cross border payments and financial settlement systems. And while this use case is widely discussed, real world adoption takes time. and it depends on how quickly financial institutions are willing to integrate new systems into their existing infrastructure, as well as how regulatory frameworks develop in major markets. And these processes can move slowly and sometimes unpredictably, which is why patience is often a key factor for anyone following this space. When thinking about a specific holding like 5,000 XRP, it is also important to understand personal risk and financial responsibility because every investor has a different situation, different goals, and different levels of risk tolerance. And what may seem like a small position for one person could represent a significant investment for another, which is why decisions should never be made based on hype, emotions, or pressure from online narratives, but instead should be based on careful research and personal financial planning. It is also worth repeating that markets can go through long periods of uncertainty where prices move sideways or even decline before any major trend becomes visible. And during these phases, many people lose patience or make emotional decisions. But experienced participants often focus on long term fundamentals rather than short term fluctuations because they understand that technological adoption does not happen in a straight line, and progress is often gradual rather than immediate. As the financial world continues to evolve, it is clear that digital assets will remain part of the broader conversation about the future of money, but which specific assets will play the most important roles is something that will only become clear over time as real world usage expands and systems are tested at scale. And until that point, all expectations should remain balanced with caution and realistic thinking. For those who are interested in XRP, it is always important to stay updated with reliable information, follow developments in regulation and adoption, and avoid making decisions based purely on speculation or social media hype. Because the most successful approach in any financial market is usually one that combines knowledge, patience, and discipline rather than emotional reactions to short term news or price movements. And finally, before concluding, it is essential to include a clear financial disclaimer. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice, investment advice, or a recommendation to buy or sell any asset, including XRP. And anyone considering financial decisions should do their own research and consult with a qualified financial advisor if needed, because all investments carry risk, including the risk of losing capital. If you found this breakdown helpful, staying informed and continuing to learn about the evolving digital asset space can make a big difference in how you understand future opportunities, and engaging with content like this can help you stay aware of new developments as they happen. So consider supporting the content by liking, subscribing, and staying connected for more updates and analysis on XRP and the broader crypto market. And with that, the full picture comes together, showing both the potential and the risks, and reminding us that while 5,000 XRP may seem like just a number today, its true significance will ultimately depend on how the future of global finance unfolds over time.